So Edna, welcome to the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group. It's a real pleasure to have you, and you've shared a real diverse corpus of texts with us on everything from, who gets to count as fully human, related to maternity, related to HIV, histories of childhood and birth, and biopolitics, necropolitics are big themes in here. And we were just talking about your forthcoming book on reparations. So this builds on some related conversations that we've been having with some of the scholars that you cite. Alondra Nelson was on here early in the pandemic talking about the longue durée of Black Lives Matter. Tony Hatch was talking about the necropolitical warfare being experienced by Black and brown communities in the U.S. during the pandemic. And I would love to just hear your latest thoughts. What do you see? How are these things playing out? These pieces you've offered are at different snapshots in the pandemic. Some super early, like April of last year, and the scene has been very dynamic. So how do you see the color of COVID playing out today? How do you see the legacies of these carceral geographies playing out today? As some people got released, but often with not good, reintegration plans. So where are we at?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me and for digesting and sitting with my work and communing together, especially for those who are doing so in the middle of the night. I would say that this moment is particularly one that I have been privileged enough to read, reread, learn, and unlearn, and to really think deeply with history. And I'm reminded of Eric Williams, who very much said that every age rewrites history, particularly ours has been forced by the events to reevaluate our conception of history and through the economy, through politics. And in many ways, this living through the pandemic, but also through a moment of racial reckoning, through a moment in which people are really trying to fight for redistributive justice, and also an ongoing climate crisis, has really put me the ways in which we're constantly bombarded with various forms of violence today. And so in many ways, trying to find a way to undo the historical amnesia that's been accepted wholesale, especially in the context of colonialism, in the context of slavery, in the context of what Harriet Washington terms medical apartheid, has very much allowed me to really think about and be curious about what it means to fight for not just Black liberation, but the liberation of all oppressed peoples. And so in many ways, history is quite instructive, and it offers us a blueprint for how to act and how to question what kind of future we might want. And I'm very much inspired by Black feminists such as Catherine McKittrick's, whose recent book that was published in Science is so brilliant insofar that it is asking us to think and be curious about the world, to think about being creative and interdisciplinary with the question around creativity and the natural sciences. And I'm also inspired by people like Mariam Kaba, who is a prison abolitionist and has been doing excellent work in trying to disentangle and divest from the carceral state as much as possible. And so if we look at, this moment today and what it means to be reckoning with coronavirus, it looks very different from a year ago. So a year ago, there were massive inequalities that were at place in terms of who was dying from the disease, who was considered an essential worker, not just in the US, but also in the UK. There was also the problem and the question of what was made visible, the death of George Floyd, the death of Breonna Taylor, and the frustration that people, specifically Black Americans, were having to face and mourning for Black life. And a year later now, we're in a situation whereby the question of equity is coming down to who on a global scale has access to a vaccine, who is part of a kind of vaccine underclass, depending on where you are, where you're located, and what does that look like, and what does it mean to actually ensure that there's equity information concerning pharmaceutical knowledge production with respect to medical work and also just like what does universal healthcare actually look like on a global scale, so that it's not just relegated to those in North America and Europe, but really something that is redistributed in a genuine decolonial manner. So all of this is just to say that part of what I'm working through, and I hope others are as well, is to really navigate and think about what it means to provide restoration and compensation for those who've had to deal with the trauma of the past 14 months, while also making sure that it's not just a question of charity, but rather, you know, people have worked and been exploited and deserve equity and justice in the realm of medicine and health, especially as so many of us who've been oppressed, or historically so, have to undo the material, cultural, and psychic damage of colonialism, capitalism, and so forth. But I'll stop there for now because I've been rambling.
Others definitely feel free to jump in if you have questions. Just unmute yourself or raise your hand. I've got some other questions. Just, you know, I think the different texts that you're mobilizing to theorize this moment, you know, from Foucault to Achille Mbembe with Necropolitics to Ruth Wilson Gilmore's Golden Gulag, I think you're really sort of theorizing a way that, you know, in the words of Alexander Wheelier, these racializing assemblages are doing the works of violence and accounting for how bodies are made precarious and made vulnerable by these distributed assemblages. So, you know, I think in cases like slavery, it's easy to see there for a reparative justice or a restorative justice or reparations, like you're working on in your first book. What do you see as a sort of either political response to these assemblages, or you know, how can we articulate the world otherwise? What kinds of work needs to be done?
So I would say the first step to a political response would be writing about it, you know, speaking to what and articulating the tensions between historical silences in history and the glaring canons of history. And I'm one recent documentary film that I was inspired by was Wrapup Exterminate the Brutes, which beautifully articulates and shows from a very like visual essay the unholy alliance between the powerful and history making, and how the harm of forgetting the past very much contributes to the minimization of the crimes that have been committed, whether it's genocide or resource extraction, etc. And so doing that work of history writing for me is the first step to unlearning the historical lies that have been put into place, because then that becomes a tool and mechanism by which one can speak about how to undo that harm. So for example, the question around housing inequity, I think in many ways, Ta-Nehisi Coates's Atlantic article from 2014, The Case for Reparations, what made it open up a new debate about reparations, at least on a national scale within the US context, is by saying, okay, let me trace what housing policies were like that and how they impacted Black people in America, by looking at very like usury loans that made it very difficult for people to pay off. And then from there, what did it mean for them to be dispossessed? And then from there, how was that racially motivated? And from there, how much money did people lose based off of these housing policies? And then making the argument later, this is why we need reparations based off of this one policy. The same could be applied to another example if we think about the history of health and medicine. To what extent do we think about or look at the question around the field of modern gynecology? J. Marion Sims, who experimented, in my opinion, unethically and immorally on enslaved Black women, used their bodies without their consent, thinking that they didn't have pain, and use that information to develop our knowledge or our perceptions about what gynecology is. And knowing that history then says, okay, what is owed to Black women and Black bodies that have been experimented on, manipulated, and whose bodies have been used for research, what do we owe to undo that damage? So that in the present day, there isn't that same undue and unjust violence. There was an excellent article by Linda Villarosa where she highlighted, even in the 21st century, not too long ago, several years ago, there was a survey done with medical students. So they're young, they're fresh, asking them, do you think Black people experience pain, or more likely or less likely to experience pain? And unfortunately, these mostly white medical students thought that Black people were more capable of being able to accept pain than white people for allegedly having quote unquote thicker skin. There's no medical or scientific basis for this. But what it points out to is that people have absorbed within the field of medicine very racist ideology from the 19th century onwards, even if they might themselves not consider themselves racist, even if they themselves don't align with a neo-Nazi party or ideology. The people have been socialized in medical field to be anti-Black. And so in many ways, the political response to dealing with that historical inequity that lives on today would mean actually having anti-racist approaches in medical institutions, having more Black doctors, having really reckoning with the present day ways in which some of those anti-Black sentiments have bled into the not just medicine, but other aspects of life. Like I pointed out, the housing question, but also within education, within the ways in which where people can travel, citizenship questions, etc. So political response has to be one that is committed to challenging the ideologies that are persist, but also to really put into place material and also technological compensation for those who in the present day suffer from these harms.
Thank you. I think Julieta had her hand up.
I can't hear you.
Yes, okay.
Let's mute you and unmute you.
That's what I was trying to
do. Sorry. Okay, that's better. Sorry, I'm like crashing Evan's computer. No, I was just one of the articles that you sent has to do with the anti-vaccine movement in Germany. It's quite specific, but it also has a lot to do with these issues of race, class, and gender, because of the kind of like, I have always thought about like the lateral thinkers there as the worst presentation of intersectionality I have ever seen, which is basically hippies and Nazis and people that are by all counts obsessed with a sense of purity, working together in the most deluded capacities, let's say. So, and like how these alliances came to be, and of course, like the historical background that gives the occasion for that convergence. I mean, it's something that is like interesting to see in light of the epidemic. I mean, like I see it also, when I hear the definitions of democracy in Germany, when they say that democracy can only happen in a homogeneous society, like this kind of like sense of homogeneous, which has always hurt a bit, because obviously one can, I cannot be German even though I live there. So it's a kind of like, I just like keep thinking how that manifests, and like, what is your take given since you were writing about it?
Yeah, so I guess if I'm going to talk like specifically about the anti-vaccine movements, and I would give it an S, and how that then ties to the present day, I would say that anti-vaccine movements have a history within the European context as an organized effort from 19th century onwards, and have had different components and constituents who have had a distrust in medicine and science for a host of reasons. There's a really excellent book by Matthew Berman called Antivaccines, where he traces that movement specifically mostly on the British context, but also some examples with the US and etc. And in some cases, it was tied to religiosity, specifically Christianity and anti-vaccination. And in other cases, it came from these very naturopathic movements that and sometimes were also covers for anti-Semitism, which I came to find is at least in the late 19th century context. And in many cases, they have this kind of not fully, but neo-Darwinian aspect to it of strong bodies, minds, and who can survive based off of a kind of purity culture about consumption. One of the more popular iterations of that is like through the Steinberg philosophy, which is a Germanic speaking kind of way of thinking about, okay, if I eat certain foods, if I deprive myself of certain goods, then I can live a long life and be healthy, etc. So in some cases, they do see themselves as quite benign people, as like, I just want to live a healthy life, but it can be quite exclusionary, it can be quite at least elitist, and it can harbor some xenophobic perspectives. And so seeing that diversity of thought, even within a movement that might be under the banner of anti-vaccination has for me also been quite illuminating, because like I've always had vaccines for various different reasons, because it was required to go to school in the context of where I was, but it wasn't until I came here to Europe, to Berlin, where people can, in some cases, opt out. And opting out comes with these very strong, deep, principles that don't align with mine. And that looks very different than, for example, ongoing conversations amongst people of the African diaspora who might be skeptical because of the harm that is done in the present day in the medical industrial complex. So as opposed to the very exclusionary, bigotry-driven anti-vaccination movement, as I documented in the German context, or even in some cases in the British and US context. So that field is very, very complicated. And with respect to this question around like that you pose, or at least the extent to which democracy or democratic processes can operate, and to what extent does homogeneity contribute to that? That's a very live, important question. I think if I think about the US, and this is something that Elizabeth Wilkerson talks a little bit about in CAS, where after emancipation, there wasn't enough racial healing that could have been done to deal with the fact that Black people had to live with the very same and alongside the very same people who oppressed them, murdered them, raped them, and so forth. And there wasn't any kind of substantive reconciliation except to say, oh, on paper you're free, but in actual practice, from day one, there was racial terror through the Ku Klux Klan, through Jim Crow segregation, the denial of claims about the 40 acres and a mule, et cetera, et cetera. And so there hasn't been, at least in that context, as heterogeneous as that society is, an opportunity to really have any kind of racial justice. And I think the W.E.B. Du Bois's premonition around the color line is the question of like what it means, what is the issue of the late 19th century, early 20th century in America. That still holds to be the case in the 21st century. And then add that to that, like migration, add to that, the question around anti-Semitism, the question around anti-Muslim sentiment, and the so-called war on terror. There hasn't been an actual reckoning to deal with the violence of the past. And then now we also see the growing and anti-Asian sentiments, not just in the United States, but even here in Europe. And so I don't have an answer as to like what it would take, except that white people need to do better. They need to like actually really get rid of, because the responsibility shouldn't just be on me or people who look like me, who didn't create this problem of racism and categorization and, you know, stealing individuals from one continent and transporting them to another. But really there has to be substantive giving up of power, giving up of privilege, and actually dealing with that past in a way that we can heal, like really heal from the trauma of the past, because everyone needs to do that healing, not just people of color.
Oh, go ahead, Amina.
Thank you. I'm going to wander my way to a question, if that's all right. You mentioned Isabel Wilkerson. I'm thinking about at the beginning of her book, she runs with a metaphor of parasitism and disease as evil. And you also speak quite a bit about the end of the 19th century. You mentioned in one of your articles about Robert Koch and funding some of the anti-Semitic and also anti-vax movement. And I'm wondering, and then you also mentioned religiosity and purity culture, and all of these things seem to be winding around and funded by something that is a metaphor, but also is more than a metaphor of disease or of certain castes of people as the germ, as the threat, as the other, right? And so here we are in this last year where you have Black Lives Matter protests and pandemic, and these things seem to be linked together by a theory of disease that is also infused with a religiosity and a fear, which you speak about, not necessarily in religious terms, but it seems like it's there, especially in the southern parts of the US and evangelicalism and these kinds of things. So I'm just wondering if you could, if you've noticed aspects of social life that are bound up with a religiosity, but also with germ theory and with a demonizing of creatures, whether it's bats, entire towns, Wuhan, if it's the Black man, like there's just a threat out there that also seems somehow tied to the germ and to religion.
So I would say, by way of answering that question, the part of what has allowed me to become, or at least motivated me to become, a historian of science is the personal kind of experience and the personal kind of journey through my history of understanding who and what gets perceived to be a vector of illness and disease, and how that's played out amongst people of my background. And so part of that for me was an exploration of, and I've written about this already, the Haitians, specifically in the context of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, were seen, and they were the only ethnic group that was perceived to be a vector of HIV/AIDS, and what impact that had on migration, what impact that had on housing, what impact that had on neighborhoods and communities that were developing, people's access to resources, all of that tied to a myth, a stereotype, a kind of hearkening of X group is somehow disease by virtue of their ethnicity. And as a Haitian descended person, I wasn't really like conscious of all of what was happening because I was a very young person, or not even born up for part of it. But I'm aware of that history, and I know that impacted the life opportunities of my elders, specifically the elders that migrated to the United States, and the implications that have for where we could live. And so given that, I've always tried to ask and think deeply, like, who else was considered a vector of disease? And even in my public health research, seeing how over and over again in my public health training, there was a way that the public health material would say, oh, sex workers, they're a vector of disease, or they're at risk, they're this. And the language, as if these individuals, by their very being, are the ones, as opposed to, okay, but what about the Johns? Like, aren't they vectors of disease? Like, why is it why is the positionality and or the ways in which we think about that labor very much stigmatizing one group of people and stigmatizing queer people? And so this question around how do we understand or work through the historicization of peoples who've been considered to be diseased, whether it's HIV, whether it's syphilis, whether it's malaria, etc., obviously has a different, it's a different kind of person who might be stigmatized. And I try to unpack that in my work, whether it's looking at even something like maternal mortality and why, you know, what are the statistics and why do the health outcomes look at the way they do for Black women or Black people with wounds, Black people with wounds, and really trying to unpack that as much as possible. I can't speak to the religiosity and how those ideas are formed insofar that I'm very atheist. So when I look into religion, it's an outward look of, okay, well, people are claiming X and they're doing Y. There might be consistencies in what their religion actually stands for. And in some ways, I don't think it's always religiosity and let's be very clear, at least in the US context, Christianity, the thing per se in its purest sense that is impacting what decisions are people making, because there are huge inconsistencies between what they call the Old Testament and the New Testament, but rather how they use their power, will, and just their own kind of anxieties about sex, sexuality, fluids, willfully trying to stay ignorant to then determine which bodies they deem to be healthy or not, and then going from there. So for me, it's more of a question of the affect of religiosity more so than the religion itself, because that's open for interpretation, and I am no theologian. I'm not going to go through like those texts in that way, but rather just see, you know, what is the motion that is actually impacting them, and what do they write to say that defends? Because if we look at religiosity, on the one hand, like even with the question around slavery, like people use religion to justify the enslavement of Black people, saying, oh, well, you're from the tribe of Ham, I think that's what it is, or person of Ham, which was banished. But then if one goes to the New Testament, I think Jesus or Jesus was like, we should love everyone. Like, and so it's like clearly strategic cherry picking of different parts of these texts to justify what they want to do. And that is, at the end of the day, slavery is profitable. And it was even if it meant the destruction of peoples, languages, cultures, and a massive displacement of folk. But yeah, so like the fact that they called themselves Christian and chose one section of the text, to me, it has I'm not necessarily one to be like, okay, well, this is the way in which theologically this is consistent or inconsistent, but rather, okay, they're just making these claims, and we need to, as much as possible, to see see it for what it is, which is pure bigotry under the guise of religion.
Thanks for that.
I mean, like, just like wondering again about, I mean, like, just like thinking about like the lines, right? Like, as the lines have come up a few times, like the, you know, like the class line, race line, like all these kind of like very neat divisions that we try to make between the animal and the human, the disease that can or cannot cross, the demographics that cannot or cannot cross purity and like all these kinds of constructions, right? Like I mean, I just like keep thinking how like in a way a particular virus or like whatever it is that makes a plague won't respect these lines, and at the same time is walking through them. Yeah, like it. Of course, it will cross the animal, human, class, gender, whatever lines, and it will also emphasize, at least in the case of COVID, these particular boundaries. You know, like the differences between who can afford to stay at home and lock themselves for a year, and who actually and suffer loudly and like mourn and think about the before and the after times and when I could travel and so on, and the people that actually live hands to mouth and can't afford not to go out on the streets and be exposed constantly. So like there is like this double play of lines that the virus emphasizes. Yeah, like I just was wondering if you could speak a little bit on that, if it's something that
yeah, I would say that maybe it's more of a spectrum than a line, like that things are always so clear and sharp, and that those things might change depending on where people are. Like when thinking about even my own privileges that I move in and out of, as a Black person, as a woman, as a queer person, there are ways in which society doesn't give me the respect I deserved. But then as someone who has US citizenship, I can travel to far more countries than the cousins that I have who have a Haitian passport and only a Haitian passport, and having a higher education, etc. And so, and thinking about even just like how those identities shift based on where I am and how I move through space, or how I'm perceived, it isn't for me, or doesn't feel like a fully sharp line per se. But I take your point that obviously something like class, to be part of a working class and what that comes with, or to be working poor, or just a poor and homeless, versus someone like Jeff Bezos, and having that amount of wealth, that it's just, those are two very different experiences in the world that would impact one's ability to live. And one of the things that, if we think specifically on the question of life and lifespan, over the past year and a half, the lifespan of white people in America has decreased like about a year because of COVID, and for Black people, several years, Black Americans, and that's a testament to just like one identity, and just looking at one racial identity that has shortened people's lifespan based off of the many dynamics of a certain kind of privilege, who's disproportionately an essential worker, who gets to have paid time off, who is evicted, who, or more likely to be evicted, who has to provide for a sick family member and has either state compensation or not. Like all of Black in itself is not enough to tell me what's going on, but the experiences that come with specifically racism and that experience of housing discrimination, labor discrimination, etc., compensation, all compound together to then create a dynamic by which people's lives are shortened. And it's, again, not just that one identity, but it's just the plethora of things that come with what it means to live as a Black person in this world. And then beyond that too, and this is something I've written a little bit about, and I think it's great that there's been activism around it. It's like, what does it mean for people who are incarcerated in this moment to have to deal with the pandemic, and what, to really be, unfortunately, in a cage, and to have your life shortened in that context. And then for society, or some members of society, to say your life is not worthy because I deemed you to be X, Y, and Z, and therefore you're not, you have to have everything, your humanity stripped from you. And what that does, not just to the physical body, but the mental state of being in the world, that is something I think, if an alien came down from outer space and saw that, would just be it would just be like, oh, you people are inhumane to have such a system. So I think that, like, yeah, talking about also the question around the carceral state and the extent to which that also contributes to the ability to live or not, and how living and morbidity manifests is something that really needs to be at the forefront of any kind of liberation framework for health and medicine, which is why I think abolitionists, prison abolitionists are spot on in trying to be unapologetic about that, and really to resist. And hopefully that could be a blueprint for other movements on a global scale as well.
I mean, just the okay, like the one last thing that like this reminds me of very much is like this category, which for me is incredibly problematic, which is the essential workers, which is, of course, work that has always been underpaid, undervalued, under everything, and never or very rarely performed by white people. So this moment of all of a sudden like being deemed as essential, but under which conditions, and what does it mean, and what does it entail, and if it's anything, I mean, like, what does the category comprise for the good and for the bad? Yeah, like that. So it was very illuminating to see all this labor, care work, domestic work, really like manual labor, grocery, I mean, like labor that is really never performed by the well-educated, well-off, and white. So what actually does that mean, that word essential? And something I've been grappling with for a while. So I mean, in terms of the lines, I don't believe in the lines at all, but I see them described constantly as explanations in terms of like, how to address, issues of gender, issues of class, like just about everything. It's like, okay, there is a border in the black and the white, between male and female, between child and adult, like all this kind of like really gross, not particularly intelligent modes of division and partition of things. So anyway, yeah, on to essential, and then I'm gonna stay quiet afterwards.
Yeah, and I think that for any of these terms, we should be unpacking them. I think that's absolutely a right approach. And beyond that, it's like, okay, well, what do people mean when they say quote unquote essential workers? And thinking about one form of labor I have never had to do, and I just don't have to do it right now, which is childcare in any capacity, and how people who might be working and providing for and caring for their own children in a domestic space, and they may not necessarily have to leave that space to do that work, but it is quite essential to regenerate the next generation, to provide care for the next generation of workers, and the undervalued, or in some cases, no value that is put towards that labor by society, and specifically in the US, or at least by the government. And specifically, like when I think about in Haiti, there is no maternal Elterngeld, or parents' money, as they call it here in Germany. And it's just like, that to me is, it's absurd. Obviously, there have been conversations in the past year about this, a lot of attention in articles or in publications like the New York Times, the Atlantic, etc. And people are trying to fight for some kind of compensation from, specifically in global North countries, so that people can deal with that essential work in a domestic space that has gone uncompensated for so long. But it is telling that that wasn't part of the essential worker label, childcare in a domestic space, because people take it for granted. Society takes it for granted that some people will provide that care without compensation, without gratitude, and I find it absurd personally. Like I'm a very I have a lot of rage, and I would have so much rage if I was expected to do that labor for free without some kind of assistance. And yet that is in the context of COVID, people have had to figure that out and to really suffer within that domestic space. So yeah, the essential worker category, where who that gets applied to and who gets compensated or not, really needs to be questioned in this moment.
Happy news on that front. As of, I think, a couple months from now in the US, families will be getting $300 a month per child who have children. I think it's per child. Some new law just got passed.
Okay.
And Stephanie, go ahead. You've got your hand up.
Yeah. Thank you, Edna, for these excellent articles. And in one article, the troubling post-colonial histories of medicine, you discuss Agil Mbembe's necropolitics as it relates to COVID-19. But how does this current acute stage of a pandemic, the necropolitics, relate to the more chronic daily acts of violence, whether that is gendered violence, racial violence, colonial violence, symbolic violence? So the more chronic types rather than the acute manifestation of necropolitics, how about those? And I was just reminded of that because in my own work, I was reading Stanley Cavell, the American philosopher, about the small deaths of everyday life takes lethal form in the course of unfolding violence. So I was wondering, how does this distinction between these various types of violence and politics, necropolitics, how does this manifest differently in Germany in comparison to the US, given also that the healthcare system is fundamentally different? And as I understand, you're currently based in Germany, right? In Berlin. So yeah, if you can talk a little bit more about this notion of the acute and the chronic manifestation, on the one hand, necropolitics, but also these different forms of violences.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And even just stepping out and thinking about, for example, just COVID, and there's COVID as a kind of disease that one can get, and some people might just have symptoms for a couple of weeks, and others can have the long COVID. So I'm recently there are NHS workers in the British context that have had the long COVID and have stated that it has kept them from their job. And part of the reason they were more likely to get it was that early on, they weren't provided with the proper protective gear in some cases, or the regulations around testing, etc., meant that even despite having a national healthcare service, they were made especially vulnerable. And that then very much contributed to it. Like now, people are really, even as healthcare workers, dealing with this like long delay of this disease. And the long COVID has also played out in other countries here in Germany and in the United States as well, and beyond. So even with the COVID in itself, one could also look at the acute versus the chronic, and the extent to which one's body can be susceptible to anything from brain fog, your lung capacity is diminished. One study I looked at showed that even cognitive function, IQ, could potentially diminish. So I was like, okay, that is something to take into consideration. And then beyond that, okay, so the question around chronic and everyday violence and what that looks like in this period. I think one issue that I found difficult, and it doesn't impact me personally, but from people that I know who are transgender, is that COVID then became an excuse for their procedures, whether it was sex-affirming surgery, to be postponed, to be justified because they weren't a priority. Well, for someone who had planned on or needed sex-affirming surgery as a transgender person, that is, for them, it is a priority to have the procedures, the medication, all of these other things that are necessary. And so the pandemic became an excuse for their medical procedures to be postponed or forestalled. And that invisibility, in some ways, to me, is part of a kind of chronic violence that can occur with those who are marginalized. Like, what does it mean to think about the most visible versus those who have been denied? And with that, and we see this in the context of the US and the rise of the far right, specifically on the transgender question, that it has also been an opening for them to take off their gloves and spew their transphobia through policy and really targeting transgender children and youth as part of their kind of far right kind of mantra. And so I bring these things up mostly because it's important to highlight, while it is happening in a pandemic, B, a lot of this is tied to medicine and health, and which health procedures are seen as prime and prioritized in this moment. And yet what it's going to mean looking forward, especially in this, like, as we approach something nearing, at least living with COVID, but living in a way that it doesn't transmit as much, what it means to also think about the care that should be provided to those who need and want the mental assistance that they need, the gender affirming assistance that they need, specialized procedures that might also be, that might give people more opportunities. In one article I wrote about specifically reproductive assisted technologies and the extent to which Black people have access to that. And that is also something that may not be, depending on where one is, considered a priority, but for some people that might be, and especially if they're having issues reproducing. So it's like thinking for me, like the dynamism between what is a priority, what isn't within the medical framework in a pandemic has been something that I'm really committed to unpacking. But then even beyond that, the everyday violence, I think in the German context, it's a bit complicated because there is a national, well, that's the thing, it's a federalist, disjointed public and private system, but you still pay for public, and it's like multiple public healthcare, so like insurance companies. It's a bit complicated, but nevertheless, everyone has the right to have access to it, which is not the case in the US at the moment. But what I would say is that people have different versions of what access to healthcare might mean. So in the German government, abortions are not covered by the state. That is something you have to pay out of pocket. Birth control pills are not covered by the state. That is something you have to pay out of pocket. However, they do pay for reproductive assisted technology. So it's so complicated how, like, the medical regime here is very much based off of reproducing the next generation, as opposed to providing people with wounds full autonomy over their bodies. And this is even before the pandemic, but obviously some of this stuff was exacerbated post and during the current pandemic. So.
Thank you.
Rachel, go ahead.
Hey, Edna, thanks so much for being with us today. My question is two-pronged for you. I guess the first portion is something that you said earlier about sort of reimagining public health and in a genuine and decolonial manner. And I was thinking a lot about this conversation that Melissa Harris Perry had with bell hooks a number of years ago. I think it was at NYU. And, they were sitting together talking about amazingly important things, and just imagining, and one of the things that Melissa Harris Perry mentioned was the profound and dynamic creativity and imagination that it takes to organize around and work on things that systemically have not been represented or mainstreamed or done on large scales. And I was thinking about your piece where you were writing about Alondra's work, and you talk about the I think your quote was autonomous community health networks, an anti-racist model that could be useful for Medicare for all. So I just wondered if you might maybe imagine out loud with us a little bit more about you know, what you projects or other things like that, either through historical memory and through your work, or things that you see alive today collectively happening that are moving in that direction that you want to see, that imagination and that creativity, that creative work that you really want to see. And then the other part of my question is really just what's sustaining you right now as you do this important work of bringing the history of medicine, the history of science to much broader publics in such a consistent and powerful force that you do.
So I guess the first thing I would say is that like my vision of the world is in many ways is very biased. Like I, as a Haitian American, very much lend towards feminist, anti-colonial folk like Claudia Jones, Annie Cizet, Sarah James, Ferenc Fanon, and others. And for all of them, they were very much committed to imagination and fighting for something in a world that moved beyond the atomization that we experience so often. And I'm especially grateful for the theoretical contributions of Robin D.G. Kelley and Freedom Dreams. That book is so excellent because it calls into question for us to really expand our everyday experiences and to think about new ideas, new theories, new knowledge. And to do so, not just a surface level, like, oh, self-love, self-care, but through social movements, through organizing, through writing. And I'm especially grateful for the Combahee River Collective, who, as like Black queer feminists, were very much about thinking about and unpacking so much of the anti-Black racism and also anti-feminism and certain movements. So when I was citing Alonjo's work, which is quite excellent, it was also pointing to what the Black Panther Party did. Like in the wake of massive dispossession of Black people, they were like, okay, let's organize ourselves. So they had not just health clinics in different chapters to really attend to people's health on a local level, but they also had a free meal program for youth and kids. They had like a cultural minister, Emory Douglas's work, like that's many of the artworks we've seen was through him. And I think in many ways, if we think a lot about what does it mean to reimagine and reorganize our health and our being, is to sometimes look in the past and to see, oh wow, those examples work, collectivity works, like coming together works, learning works, being fun with it works. But we're also in the 21st century, so like we have the internet, we have digital cultures, we can be experimental, we can engage in what Adrienne Marie Brown refers to as pleasure activism, and we can also just like for me and my work in this moment, what's sustaining me is reading, rereading, and reading some more. So I really love like Kaisus Lemon's writing. He wrote an essay in which he recently said like the struggle against oppression is that our flesh and our brains and our blood and bones and hearts and souls. And so anything that one is doing in the way that he wrote in this article about what we're owed, it was in New York Times Magazine or New York Magazine, and it was just like brought up to like how important it is to like move through space, through writing, imagination, and through community. So that has been sustaining me, although obviously at different levels, because I'm still in a white majority country, city, where there's a lot of xenophobia. Like Berlin, in spite of presenting itself as cosmopolitan, can sometimes still be quite xenophobic and anti-Black. So working through that has been a struggle. Working through not having seen my family in 2 years has been a struggle. Working through the fact that there have been people in my family who've had COVID and one person who died. Like it's a constant struggle to have to work and write, but writing in many ways has been the gateway for me to really assert myself, to learn from my elders, those that I knew or didn't know, and to really fight for a world in which there's some kind of justice and care and love that can honor all lives. So, yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing your work with us, Edna. It's really rich and important. And I might gesture to some of the broader ways that this is important to multi-species studies. There's a conversation going on right now about the promise of multi-species justice. A group of junior scholars and some leaders in the field are thinking with post-colonial theorists and critical race theorists to try to think about intersectional possibilities and also the politics of articulation that we might do to identify lively possibilities for flourishing amidst these deadly racializing assemblages. And I think, you know, more work like yours is so critical to this field. And there's one particular person who's writing for this collection, Elizabeth Laura, who I'll try to put you two in touch. She's writing about prison gardens in California prisons, and in the context of COVID and in the context of carceral geographies, arguing that abolition is multi-species justice, or multi-species justice is one route to abolition. Also, I want to plug next week, we have Forrest Roher, who's a virologist who is basically sequencing the virusphere. He's sort of the Rob Dunn of the virusphere. So Amina's a resident in Rob's lab, and Forrest is going to be talking to us about the enormous viral biodiversity of our oceans, phages, which are hardly known. And he's done some of the key work to basically identify the unknown, to say that there is 99% of the virus here is totally unmapped. So we'll be talking with him. But thanks again, Edna. This was a fantastic discussion, and I really value this work, and I think it's so important, and can't wait to see the books.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Thanks, Edna.
Thank you.
And please come back. We'd love to have you back.